And our next guest recently participated in what is being called the largest act of Jewish civil disobedience, perhaps in history. I will find out about that. Stosh Cotler is the CEO of Bend the Arc Jewish Action, and this particular civil disobedience was conducted in support of the Dreamers, who are being excluded from the American dream by the current administration and Republicans in Congress as we record this. And here to talk about that and whatever else comes up now is Stosh Cotler. So first of all, Stosh, thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks for doing this action too. Let's talk about this. Yeah. Let's start there. This was an act, a Jewish-led act of civil disobedience. Why specifically did it seem that Jewish activists were morally called upon to move in defense of Dreamers?
Yeah, great question. So the Jewish community is so incredibly supportive of immigrant justice overall, and we have an extremely high level of support for passing a Clean Dream Act in particular. And so our work at Bend the Arc Jewish Action, along with so many other Jewish organizations, has been to lift up this issue as a central concern for all Americans and to stand in support with our immigrant justice partners and with the courageous dreamers who have been leading the way so brilliantly.
And I think it's such a resonant issue for me personally, and for others. I think history and the Jewish Americans' role in history has changed so much over the last 75 years or so. I think it's important to support dreamers and other immigrants into this country, no matter what your background is. But I feel, as someone who has a Jewish background himself, that there is a particular moral obligation for groups like ours that came to the country ourselves as immigrants. And I feel as if some of us, Jared Kushner, cough, cough, some of us may have forgotten that we came to this country as immigrants, as despised and disliked and rejected immigrants in many cases, and that to do so now, to turn our backs now on our brother and sister immigrants in their hours of need is not only immoral, but a betrayal of our own history. I don't know. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think you have just summed it up so beautifully. I know that during the action itself, I was wearing my grandpa Leo came to this country when he was 12 years old, and I was wearing his prayer shawl, his tallis, during the action. And a number of the participants were also wearing ritual objects, some connected to their family members, others just as a connection to our Jewish tradition. And so many American Jews, as you just said, do have very personal stories of immigration in their families. Sometimes it's one generation removed, sometimes just a few, but there are so many of us who relate on a very, very deep emotional and resonant level with the issues that are being faced by this generation of immigrants and this generation of dreamers. And so not only is there this very direct experience that we can touch into in our lives, we also have in our Jewish tradition a values framework, an ethical framework, a legal framework that obligates us to take care of the quote-unquote stranger, to remind us that we were strangers in a strange land, and that we always need to be sensitized not only by our own personal experiences, but to the plight of others who are currently experiencing discrimination, abuse, and oppression. And so that story that resonates for so many Jews, although not all Jews, it's important to also name, there are certainly American Jews who don't have direct stories of immigration, but for so many Jews it does resonate, and we, from a perspective of being part of a faith constituency who are acting on our progressive values, feel like that faith voice, that values-based voice is also very needed and can be very effective.
I feel I'm so glad you're doing this work. I feel that somehow there was a time. I mean, look, I'm old, and so I'm fairly old, and so I remember a time. Put it this way: my Christian mother converted to Judaism when she married my father, and in some ways was more involved with it than my father. And I remember asking her at one point, and she's why she did it, and she said one of her reasons was to identify with the oppressed. I mean, there was a time when it was understood that to be Jewish was to be part of an oppressed people. Things are, maybe the dynamics changed, the understanding has changed. It was also understood in the 60s, for example, when I was a child, that to be Jewish meant you were probably, very progressive. And I think the polls still show that Jewish Americans tend to be more progressive, but that you would stand in solidarity on civil rights and those types of things. And I feel somehow that maybe one of the valuable things that groups like Bend the Arc are doing is kind of reviving a sense. Maybe it's just my personal subjective experience, but I feel as if that identity, that particular dimension of the Jewish American identity, got diluted a little bit and lost a little bit. And I feel somehow one of the valuable things that groups like yours do is re-energize that. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Well, first, I just want to say you went out a little bit, so I hope that I got as much of your question and what you were saying before. So hopefully my answer is going to make sense to what I think you said. American Jews have experienced historically, when our ancestors, grandparents, great-grandparents, or parents came to this country, a number of American Jews did experience very intense discrimination and persecution here in the United States, as well as danger and violence in the countries from which they were fleeing or leaving from. And that experience, that direct experience of being an oppressed people, being a religious minority, we're still less than 2% of the American population. That has created, in my opinion, an empathy and a sensitized worldview that thankfully has been retained over the many decades and generations that American Jews have lived in the United States. And I think one of the things that's so fascinating when we look at demographics of the American Jewish community, that we have simultaneously and historically been a very liberal to progressive community. If you take a look at how we vote, where we put our volunteer time, the way that we engage in philanthropy, many measures indicate that we are very much a liberal to progressive community. And over the last 50 and 60 years, the Jewish community overall, not every individual, but overall, has also experienced a tremendous amount of increased security, increased safety, more opportunity through education. And what we have now is a community that has a different amount of power in American society. And Bend the Arc's work is to harness that lived experience and empathy coming from persecution with the amount of power that American Jews have in our country to leverage that power for the common good. And one of the very complex things that is happening now is, again, as anti-Semitism becomes more exposed and as white supremacy and white nationalism is on the rise, we've seen that American Jews are also now experiencing anti-Semitism, along with, of course, immigrants, people of color, the Muslim community. And so we believe it is very much our responsibility, as well as in our self-interest, to be banding together with all of those communities who are currently being targeted by an overtly racist president, an overtly xenophobic, anti-Muslim president who makes no bones of associating himself with white supremacists. And we believe it's imperative that we join forces, that we speak out in protection of one another, and that we understand that this country is not only going to be really living up to the highest ideals of what America could and should be, not by keeping any of us out, not by making any of us illegal or deporting us or jailing us, but by recognizing that we are what has actually contributed to the very fabric of this society, and we all have a right to be free and safe.
Yeah, I absolutely understand what you're saying. And again, we're talking with Stosh Cotler, CEO of Bend the Arc Jewish Action. The one dimension of my question that I got lost in the static somewhere, I think that's very on point to what I was asking. But I was also saying that the energy behind that social justice commitment seemed to get diffused over the decades. I feel like maybe it's beginning to come back now, and that's the role of groups like yours, because it is, inherently, I think, part of the Jewish tradition. And you raise a tremendous point, which is that the anti-Semitism that, for example, my father's generation experienced, and to a little bit, he had his career limited by anti-Semitism when I was a child. I think that is coming back. I think that that's a really important point, and we can react to that as a community one of two ways. We can either band together and, that old question, is it good for the Jews? Just think about ourselves, or we can realize that's in solidarity brings strength. And I think what you're saying is that by reaching out to other groups that are being targeted, we help them and ourselves, right?
Absolutely. And you're going back to the original point you were making. I do really want to emphasize that there may be a perception that American Jews have not been as present in progressive spaces or.
Okay, it looks like we lost the signal for a second there. We're going to try to get her back. We've been talking with Stosh Cotler, CEO of Bend the Arc Jewish Action. That's the problem with this technology. We're working on getting her back. But, I think the sense that the Jewish community is beginning to re-energize politically, go back to its social justice roots of the 40s and 50s and 60s is very important. I also think, by the way, that there's a lot to find encouraging in the poll numbers I've been reading about millennial Jewish Americans. I think that there's much more of a progressive standing as there are with millennials of all generations, and I also think there is a chance to really forge a new Jewish identity. We have Stosh Cotler back with us from Bend the Arc Jewish Action. And Stosh, I just wanted to ask you one last question. I don't want to lose the topic of the day, which is the DREAM Act and what we can do for the dreamers who are our brothers and sisters in crisis right now. We're recording on Wednesday. This will go out to our affiliates on Saturday and Monday. Any thoughts on what we might expect in the coming days and weeks there?
Yeah, well, Bend the Arc Jewish Action and our partners around the country are gearing up to continue our mobilization. We are continuing to fight in very close communication with our immigrant justice partners, and American Jews are going to continue to keep the pressure up because we are so very committed to passing a Clean Dream Act. We see that this is such an urgent and moral crisis, and our immigrant family members, friends, neighbors, and community members are at risk of being jailed and deported, and we know that we have to just keep the pressure up. So my sense is that Americans should be out in the streets. We should be calling our elected officials. We should be making our voices known. If anyone is interested who's Jewish, who wants to learn more about how to do that Jewishly, if you go to bendthearcjewishaction.us, we can get you hooked up. And we know that the vast majority of Americans support a Clean Dream Act. We actually know that in both the House and Senate, there are enough votes to pass a Clean Dream Act. And so we have a shot at making this a reality, and that's what we're going to keep our focus on.
Well, keep up the great work. And just for our listeners, we did have a dreamer scheduled for this program. It did not work out because of scheduling problems on her end, but we will continue to track this story closely. And Stosh Cotler, CEO of Bend the Art Jewish Action, thanks for all your great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.